Welcome back everyone to the Build and Learn series in Stanford Bay. Today we're going to begin work on our port. This is something we've talked about in the most recent episodes while we've been working on our industrial park, and this is largely an extension of the industrial area. But I do have an announcement. On Wednesday of next week, we're going to be posting our second video as a part of the City Skylines 2 Early Access. The video will premiere on YouTube so you can watch it live, and there will be a live stream to follow where I can answer some basic questions and talk about what's featured in the video. I hope you guys are excited because we're going to be diving deeper into City Skylines 2 well ahead of its release date. So if you haven't checked out the first video, obviously I'd recommend doing that, but be sure to hit the subscribe button on the channel so you can be up to date with future videos. Leave a like, drop a comment down below with what you're looking forward to seeing, and let's get to building our port. So I think pretty early on we established an area that I wanted the port to be. However, this is going to take some work. I felt like I had enough room for the port, but I shifted it a little bit closer to the industry instead of spreading it out as much as I had initially intended. So that was going to make this area feel a little bit more consolidated, which I don't think is a negative. And some of that came from wanting to include the cargo terminal that also includes the railway. And some of this complicates how I place things because obviously I need rail access. But what I found is a railway that is off the kind of area that we're typically building. It's further down here, and I'm going to connect this railway attached to the cargo station to that, and then also have it connect to our industrial area we've been working on in the recent episodes. And obviously this is going to give us a bunch of rail infrastructure for cargo to kind of maneuver to the different industrial parts of the city. Now I will admit, over the course of recording this episode, I did have a few things that kind of kept changing. So you're going to see a little bit of fluidity with how I make some of the decisions and how I set things up, because I kept running into these goofy little problems, and some of it was just, I didn't prepare for certain things, or I didn't have the best plan for how I was going to lay out this area. Like, I know what buildings I want in a specific space like this, but it's kind of hard to lay out, especially when you start incorporating, the water line and how to factor things in and how big each building is. So typically what I'll do is I'll start by placing one of the cargo stations that I know I want, or some sort of like infrastructure building, something that I know needs to be there, which in this case is the cargo terminal we've already set down. The one thing I wish they would have done with this asset is actually had the train line opposite side of the road. So the road ran like in between like a train line and the rest of the asset that was like attached to the coastline. Something like that I think would have worked way better for how this is set up. Now I'm going to go ahead and connect it to the infrastructure already in place, but this is all going to end up changing by the end of the episode because I increased capacity and make some adjustments to accommodate more buildings and structures that need a little bit more space from the water line to a road. Now you may notice that I'm getting rid of the roads that come with these assets, and you can do that by using Move It. You hold Alt and click the end node and then delete, and you can actually replace the roads by just drawing a road in its place. This is kind of handy, especially if you want to match some of the different roads that you already have in the city. Instead of just using your normal, 2-lane road, I'm using the industry's roads. For waterfront buildings, what I'm looking to do is trying to create basically a wall that runs across the coastline. So all our structures along the waterline are going to be pretty tight together and sort of create that single wall that runs all along our coast. I'm also going to be using some retaining walls from the workshop. This is going to help continue this sort of look and cover up some rough edges, especially when I get into like terrain conforming. The assets I tend to like to use are by Clus. They're on the workshop, and he has a whole set of different retaining walls with different variations attached to them. And remember, in the description below the video, I do have a whole list of assets that I'm using for this build, so you can typically find anything you need in there, along with a mod list. One thing I need to add to the asset list that I didn't have when I was doing the recording are some better tools around creating like certain heights with network assets, right? Assets that you can kind of draw out and alter the heights at nodes to control terrain height. This is super helpful when you're working with retaining walls. However, I forgot to get them before this part of the build, so I'm using another asset that I have for a different project, but I'm going to end up having to go replace those. But as we all know, terraforming can be a little bit finicky, so you're going to see me mess with this with some basic assets to help control, how the terrain operates, especially around the retaining walls. It's not perfect. I can fix it over time, but for now, it'll do. In these situations, all I'm looking to do is give us two terrain heights. One that is, your typical ground height, and then I need to control what's down below, like the water line, to make sure that it aligns properly with sort of the retaining wall we're developing with the assets and what we've added. This is typically one of the most finicky things to have to work on because you want to create that smooth water line. It takes a good amount of patience. And then of course the water is going to react to whatever you're doing. That's just a natural thing. So you kind of have to play with it and tweak it until you get in the right spot. So just be prepared if this is something you want to do, that it may not be very easy just at the first, your first attempt. You're going to have to kind of mess with it and alter it and tweak it because you typically don't want jagged edges. You're going to want something very smooth that you can cover up with something like a retaining wall. You could also use keys if you have like something that works for the aesthetic that you're building. I like to use some of these retaining walls because I think they typically look more appropriate for what I'm doing. And sometimes you can run issues, even if you use a key. If you want to get a little bit more in depth with how to use retaining walls, I have a whole video on that I made some time ago that is still really helpful for understanding how you can incorporate these in your city build, especially in urban areas. But the application of those assets and how it works is very similar to what you would do here. You often have to be resourceful when you're trying to do stuff like this. Sometimes it's about trying to find the right tools or making the right adjustments just to sort of accommodate what you're going for. Something to keep in mind is when you're using networks close to terrain that's like conforming or doing something weird, sometimes just elevating them or forcing them to elevate can be a helpful way of cleaning up some edges. That's what I did with the railway there to cover up where those shadows were showing up, and really just sort of deletes the shadows because then the structure itself is different. So that's pretty helpful. There's all these little tricks you start to learn over time. Much like the industrial area we've been building, I wanted to make sure that this area still had a lot of depth and density to it. I don't want it just to feel sort of empty and a little bit lifeless. So there will be functionality, but there's also going to be extra buildings added in the form of warehouses and some unique factories to help create enough stuff here that it looks appropriate for the scale and size of the city. I don't want it to just feel empty or like it's not correct in terms of what it needs to look appropriate for the rest of the city build. And this is often something I struggled with whenever I tried to play vanilla, which was, again, relatively limited, but using just vanilla assets, you tend to run in this issue where there's just not enough. There's not enough stuff to create the area you might want. So sometimes it's about duplicating or trying to tweak things in a way that you can get away with having multiple buildings that may have the same purpose. And I will admit that setting up your coastline and trying to find the right buildings for this is probably the hardest part of the build. After this, it becomes a much smoother sort of process in getting these buildings in place. As I've mentioned to you guys before, I don't want the videos to all just be perfect building and, perfect edits. I do want to show you guys that sometimes there is some trial and error involved even when I'm setting things up. With some tweaks and some polish, along with connecting it to our infrastructure that's already set, we get a nice little coastline set up. Again, there's going to be tweaks to this because I end up changing my mind a couple times, and then I adjust for what I expect to be the amount of traffic coming in. One thing I mentioned in the last episode that I wanted to include in this area were fuel tanks. That's something I often find when I'm looking at some aerials of ports and things like that, as well as some smokestack type buildings, some more unique factories to help make this area appear dense in an area where things are made, because I do want to add the shipbuilding facility that is, I think, a unique factory, and maybe some dry docks at some point would be kind of cool to have in this space. With the combination of unique factories and some of the stuff we have along the coastline already, it's really just a continuation or another industrial park that we're adding, but overall it's got water access, so you're going to have some traffic flowing through here, which will look pretty cool, especially in this bay area next to downtown. Something to keep in mind is obviously as you're setting this area up to make sure your infrastructure is strong enough to support the traffic. Much like we did with the industrial area, we want enough lanes and enough movement along with some one-way roads to help accommodate like moving vehicles through this space. Sometimes I'll use one-way roads on the sort of coastline road that attaches to a lot of the cargo stations or anything like that to keep traffic flowing in one direction, typically back towards the city, and have them loop back around if they need to come into that area. I think at some point what I might also do is add another interchange at the highway that's going to eventually wrap back away from this area just to incorporate another option for traffic to flow. Now, I've gone ahead and broken up some of the infrastructure already set down for roads and how they connect to the roads that were pre-existing. And I want to try to figure out how to get this dry dock in. And of course, it's going to cause me a little bit of trouble because of how the asset is sized. And more of this needs to be on land than anything else, right? So we're going to have to make some adjustments to how I intended to set this up. I just wasn't thinking about it. But ultimately, I think we get it into place. It's just going to require a little bit more of that sort of road work than I had initially intended. I go back to what I've explained before, where some of these areas just turn into puzzles. It's about fitting these assets into a sort of network of roads that makes sense and also allows you to build things closely together if you so choose. Like if you're looking to create density, you're going to have to just play with the roads until you sort of get there, right? And then the buildings are just going to be kind of fitting into those pockets wherever available. Just be mindful that whatever you set up can be reversed, it can be changed, it can be altered, and keep that sort of fluidity with how you're setting up your infrastructure, especially when you're building something of this sort of scale. Even with downtowns or other industrial parks, it's really, really easy to get locked down into a certain set of roads or something like that. You just got to keep it, kind of moving and flexible, and then it makes it a lot easier just to change. There's a lot of times where when I'm placing roads or drawing out these networks, I tend to leave them longer than they need to be. And sometimes that helps me figure out when I need to expand, like how to go about that, how to connect it to the infrastructure that's already in place. Where do I need these things to exist and what angle do I need to take them at? And then I can kind of build off that. Like it gives me something to work with. So I'm not just starting, at zero and trying to figure out how to connect everything all the time. There's some infrastructure there that makes it easier for me to kind of build off of or reconnect. Now, I keep tinkering with some of the infrastructure like I mentioned before, so I'm going to show that a little bit later. What you see now is sort of all temporary and ends up changing anyways, because there is some assets that I want to include here that are a little bit larger than I expected them to be or remembered them being. So I need a little bit more space to accommodate these dry docks that I got off the Steam Workshop. Now, I'm going to use slightly different setup in terms of the pieces because I don't really have ploppable pavement currently included in my build. So we're going to use the end piece on both sides, which some of you may, be upset about, but it'll be okay. Just a little bit easier to cover up the flat edge of this asset instead of covering up the curved edge, especially when you don't have like maybe everything in your build that you would need to normally just cover it up. In addition to these dry docks, I also have some docks that will extend out into the water that are from the Steam Workshop. Again, you can find these in the asset list in the description, but this is just to help create, again, more variety in terms of what's on the coastline. I also added the cargo station that you see at the top of the dry dock. This is just an additional cargo station place. It doesn't have the rail line, but it'll be another access point for ships to come in. I thought that might be nice having it sort of separated from the other one, giving us another sort of entry point. I don't know that I'm going to make all these buildings fully functional, especially the vanilla buildings that are going to bring in ships, because sometimes it overpopulates with boats in the bay. I want to be careful about that. I don't want it to look a little bit goofy, so I may need to download a separate mod. I need to check to see if I can help control how many ships are coming in. In my stream build, I had at one point probably 10 ships like waiting to just dock, and those were all passenger ships. I don't notice this issue as much with cargo ships. But you can see some of this is getting a little bit painstaking, which again, this is going to take a little bit of patience. A lot of it's because of the water and how certain assets operate, so I don't want to like say you shouldn't go about this and when you're trying to create your port, but ultimately anytime you start getting into like terraforming and adding in things close to water lines, I feel like you sort of double the amount of time it normally takes, right? Like the industrial park wasn't that difficult or didn't consume a lot of time. I broke it into 2 episodes because I really wanted to feature certain things, but this whole area is just a little bit extra. Like it takes just a little bit more to polish it into place and make it look all right. And in the end, I think I came out with something good. Could it use more work? 100% it needs some more work, but here we are, we'll figure it out. As we jump forward, you can see I've made the proper network connections to allow pretty decent traffic flow into this area, as well as I've moved the water treatment facility a little bit away from this space, which I think will help. Now it's about filling in a lot of what we've set up here, which is a common thing that we've done in our videos, is setting up infrastructure to then go in, kind of play the puzzle game and try to fill up our space to make it look as realistic as possible. We do have several unique factories we can add here, along with plenty of warehouses, which are pretty prominent in areas like these anyways. Now we're going to start leaning on these unique factories, as I mentioned before, to start filling the space. So I have several that I've pulled from the workshop and a few that we still haven't used, or we just may duplicate from our industrial parks to give us the density we want. If you're trying to create an area similar to this, it may just depend on what you're trying to accomplish. If you want it to be more about cargo than like shipbuilding and some of the manufacturing, you probably can just lean on like cargo-based assets like the container warehouses we use in the industrial area and maybe just warehouses. Whereas I'm leaning more on manufacturing. I don't want it to be just a cargo drop-off. I want manufacturing because I have the shipbuilding areas, the dry docks. I want it all to be around factories, and that's why we're going to lean on unique factories to help build out this space. And one thing you could do is, if you don't want the same sort of density that I'm looking for, you could tie your industrial park more closely to your port. So for example, you could have your port infrastructure on the water line, and then everything we've built in the industrial park could be behind your port area, your coastline. So you don't have to separate these two entities apart from each other. You can actually combine them and create, a pretty solid space without having to do all of like these separate industrial areas. Just trying to give you all alternatives to what you can set up. You don't have to build an industrial park separate from your port. You can combine them, you can keep them separate, you can build multiple industrial parks. There's obviously a ton of variables there, but it all goes back to sort of what is your city about? What is it established by? What is the purpose? And I think that, again, as I've mentioned in pretty much every episode, will help guide what your decision making is around adding things, building things, and how much you need of certain things. Now, everything beyond the first couple of streets close to the coastline is going to be largely focused on those factories. And I'm going to choose some that I've already used, but I'm also going to choose ones we haven't used. So this is going to spread out some of our traffic, which should be interesting to see how that pans out. And then it's also going to make this area sort of a booming part of town. I think in the end, something that I mentioned in the last episode is that this really heightens the value of Industries DLC. And what do I mean by that? Well, you have an assortment of buildings that you can plop down where you want, giving you a lot of freedom and also a diversity of buildings that you can set up in your city. So this is one reason I do recommend Industries DLC for folks that are looking for different DLCs to add to their game. In addition to stuff like Park Life, where you get a lot of different assets that you can use, and especially stuff that you can use towards detailing. There's also, of course, mass transit and plenty of other ones that have various factors that might improve the game experience or give you more options. I also really like a lot of the content creator packs, especially that have been released in the last year or so, that have added so many different buildings and given you a ton of variety of stuff that you can use in your city. I'm also going to go ahead and attach our rail line on this side of the city to our cargo station we've already placed. Then I'm going to draw another part of this rail line all the way over to the industrial area we've already set up and attach it to that end. That way we should have traffic sort of flowing for the rail lines to both parts of our city, one for the industrial area we've already set up, and then also to this cargo area. I'm also going to try to accommodate the trains coming in from either direction by kind of putting like a little loop between some of these angles, just to give options in case the trains are coming from one direction or the other. I totally forgot that there was a train line on this side, so I probably needed to connect that anyway. I may have talked about it in the planning video, I can't remember, but at least now it's connected and it's set up, and we can kind of utilize this as sort of like an in boundary of, I think, where the city is going to be developed, especially the industrial area. And you can see from this like brief aerial view how close the industry and port area are. So I can kind of see this blending together a little bit over time. I just need to figure out what to do with the highway. I think the highway could loop back to the main sort of artery that was already on the map up towards past like beyond the forestry space and the lake. But I don't really know how I'm going to go about that yet. I just kind of have it dead ending currently. We need to fix that. But at some point we'll get there and we'll try to see where that can go. I think ultimately it'd be great to have it kind of curve down behind the port, but I'm not really sure where to take it after that. So we'll just see how it goes. Maybe it dead ends there and then also kind of comes back to the main artery. That might be an option for the highway. And now that I think about it, that's probably one of the better options, because that would give a little bit of a higher speed route for some vehicles to kind of filter into that space, especially if you have it dead end towards like the middle part of the port. So maybe I'll have to see how to incorporate that and tie those together. Now I'm going to go ahead and fill in some concrete in a lot of these spaces. I will have some pockets of trees and vegetation, but largely this area is going to be pretty concrete heavy. It's going to look very industrial, with not much grass or vegetation just hanging out. If I was doing a heavier detail build, I would break up some of this concrete, maybe include some corners and stuff of just weeds. That may be something we add if we get to that point. In my stream build, I've done that a little bit in some spots, and you've seen it also in a little bit of our industries videos where I've done a little bit of detailing to give you an idea or an option for some areas. Now, like I said, I'm going to add a few more factories and warehouses to this space. I may duplicate some of the buildings we have in our industrial park. I don't think that's really an issue as long as there's some space between them. If you're not looking at the same building from the same exact angle, like you can kind of separate it enough that just by looking through, you're not going to notice that they're duplicated. You know, you're not going to notice the redundancy there. So I try very hard to cover this up on occasion. And then sometimes I realize like it's so far off or it's at a different angle or other things are covering it up that you can reuse some stuff to, again, build density and have a lot of diversity in what's set down on the ground. And I really recommend some of these warehouses I have from the Steam Workshop. You've seen me utilize them like kind of repetitively through these areas. It's really cool because you can easily combine them by like stacking them next to each other or long ways, and they can cover up kind of odd shapes. So when you have those little gaps in roads that are, you know, maybe 4 to 5 units, like you can put them in there and they will take up that space, and you draw concrete in between them or throw some trees in between them, and it'll help fill up those just dead areas that you're not sure what to do with. So I think it's helpful to kind of like navigate some of the roads and figure out where those are going to go, and then start working on placing your bigger buildings, your factories, and then fill it in with like smaller warehouses and things. That's usually kind of the hierarchy I use, because you need to accommodate the bigger buildings first, kind of figure out how the roads work around them, and then you can kind of fill in instead of putting in smaller buildings and working around that. I typically do it the opposite way, and I make it sort of intentional to do that because I just feel like that process is easier. And of course, you have Industries DLC warehouses too that are functional the same way many of the ones on the workshop are, so that can help fill up some of your space as well. And as you can tell, I've entered the time-lapse phase of the video because a lot of what's left is just me placing buildings and trying to find something that I feel like works or feels right. And that really isn't as scientific as it may seem. It's just a lot of placing and moving. And to some degree, it's like also trying to break some rules where buildings might overlap a little bit, or, you know, I'm just trying to find where they fit. And now it's hard because it's like you've already got your infrastructure in place. You've got a lot of these buildings in place where I want them to be. I don't want to like keep shifting stuff around. Like I want to find some finality in what I'm trying to do. For some reason, this video was probably one of the more difficult videos for me to create. I just kept placing things that just didn't seem to work. And I did some stuff off camera because it was just a little bit easier for me to spend a little extra time, especially along coastline, like placing the retaining wall and seawall, I guess. But ultimately, like the building selection and the building placement took me a lot longer than I expected. It tends to flow a little bit better, so I apologize if this video seems a little bit more disjointed than it normally does. I don't know if it's because I'm building off the coastline and that took me a little bit longer than expected, but considering that this relies sort of heavily on how you set up your industries area to some extent, like it's just sort of, it's kind of the same, right? It's not that vastly different. I guess I just felt like I was sort of repeating some of the same things, so I don't even know if my voiceover was that helpful, but hopefully you get some ideas and hopefully it inspires you for what you can build in your own city. I keep my ports pretty simple, but at the same time, I feel like they tend to look fine in terms of presentation. They seem to fit the part, and they're not overly complex in terms of the assets used, right? We're relying very heavily on vanilla kind of stuff, industries, DLC stuff, and just a few workshop pieces to kind of make it all come together. I'm not sure how many of you have been sort of building along with this series or just taking inspiration from, but it's been a lot of fun putting this like series together. It's something different than I'm used to because I've mostly done tutorials up to this part. So every so often I'm kind of like diving in. I'm like, I don't know if this is what I should be doing or creating or whatever. And so far so good, I guess. But I think I've learned a lot, and that's been really helpful as I start to gear up for what will be, you know, Cities 2 in the future, what we're going to be diving into as we venture into that new game, because I don't know if tutorials are the right thing to put out at the very forefront, but I do think we need some sort of content that can be, you know, posted week to week instead of just tutorials. So I'm excited to get to that point, but I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope that you are prepared for our second early access gameplay video coming out on Wednesday. Hopefully you can make it to the premiere at probably noon Eastern, followed by the live stream where I can answer some questions and talk about the video and some of the contents of the video. I'll catch you next time. Take care.